The sparks fly in a warehouse in Leicestershire. The air is thick with the smell of burning metal and industrial grease. It is the sound of a Makita angle grinder biting into solid steel. A team of National Crime Agency officers stands back, masks on, watching the blade cut deeper into the cylinder. They are looking at a massive industrial roller, the kind used in conveyor belts or heavy manufacturing. It is painted a dull, innocuous grey. It looks like scrap metal. It weighs nearly 2 tons. To the naked eye, to a customs officer, even to a drug dog, it is just a piece of machinery. But intelligence says otherwise. The grinder breaks through the outer shell. The screech of metal stops. The officers step forward with crowbars, peeling back the thick steel skin. Inside, there is no machinery. There are no gears. There is only plastic, tightly wrapped, vacuum-sealed packages stuffed into the hollow belly of the roller. Cocaine. High-purity, uncut, South American cocaine. Then they cut open another. Cannabis. Then another. By the time they are finished, they have uncovered a haul worth millions. But this isn't just a seizure. This is a message. It is the first crack in the armor of a ghost. While these officers are sweating in a warehouse in the English Midlands, the man who owns this shipment is likely sitting on a terrace in the south of Spain, a glass of wine in his hand, watching the sunset over the Mediterranean, believing he is untouchable. He is the Solihull Godfather, a man who built an empire of steel and snow, a man who thought he could outsmart the world. But the steel has been breached, and the ghost is about to become very real. To understand how a shipment this sophisticated ends up in a quiet corner of England, you have to understand the man behind it. James Mulvey was not your typical street-level thug. He wasn't a corner boy fighting for postcode territory. He was something far more dangerous. He was a logistician. Born and raised in Solihull, within the orbit of Birmingham's gritty underworld, Mulvey saw the drug game differently. He understood that the real money wasn't in selling the product, it was in moving it. He saw the flaws in the traditional methods. Mules swallowing condoms were high risk and low reward. Lorries with false floors were getting scanned at Dover every day. Mulvey wanted a method that was impervious to detection, something that relied on the sheer crushing weight of industry. He built his reputation, not on violence, though the threat was always there, but on reliability. In the criminal underworld, if you can guarantee the product arrives, you become a king. And Mulvey was reliable. But the UK was too small, too hot, and too claustrophobic for his ambition. Like many top-tier British criminals, he migrated south. He moved to the Costa del Sol, the so-called Costa del Crime, where the sun shines, the extradition treaties are complex, and the police are often looking the other way. From his base in Spain, Mulvey didn't live like a fugitive. He lived like a CEO. He rented a luxury villa for £1,000 a week. He drove high-end cars. He wore watches worth more than a detective's annual salary. He became the pivot point between the South American cartels, the Dutch transport networks, and the hungry markets of the UK and Ireland. He was the middleman who made the impossible possible. He insulated himself with layers of protection. He didn't drive the trucks. He didn't even speak on normal phones. He was a ghost in the system, a voice on an encrypted line, a shadow that the National Crime Agency knew existed but could never quite catch. He was, in his own mind, and in the eyes of the law enforcement agencies chasing him, the untouchable. The genius of Mulvey's operation lay in the rollers. It was a masterclass in smuggling. These weren't improvised containers. They were professionally engineered industrial turnbuckles and rollers. The gang would source these massive steel tubes, set up legitimate-looking transport companies, and create a paper trail that looked perfectly boring. The rollers would be sent to a workshop, often in the Netherlands. There, welders would cut them open, hollow out the heavy innards, and pack them with drugs. Not just a few kilos, but hundreds, Once filled, the rollers were welded back shut. The welds were professional, ground down and painted over to look factory fresh. They were then loaded onto flatbed trucks. When these trucks passed through customs at French or Belgian ports, the scanners faced a problem. The steel walls of the rollers were so thick and the density of the metal so high that standard X-ray machines couldn't penetrate them. The images would just show a solid black mass, exactly what a solid steel roller should look like. It was the perfect disguise. For years, Mulvey's carousel of steel moved back and forth. Drugs came in, cash went out. The rollers were delivered to industrial estates in the West Midlands, unloaded, cut open, and the drugs distributed to gangs across the UK and Ireland. The empty rollers were then scrapped or sent back to be refilled. It was a conveyor belt of cash, generating an estimated £68 million. Mulvey sat at the top of this pyramid, controlling the flow with a terrifying calmness. He used a complex system of burner phones. He would use a phone for a few weeks, or sometimes just a few days, and then destroy it. He used encrypted apps, believing his communications were beyond the reach of the authorities. He had a trusted inner circle, including his right-hand man Barry Phipps, who handled the ground operations in the UK. Mulvey's life was a cycle of luxury and paranoia. He knew the police were watching, but he believed he was too smart for them. He would often travel, moving between Spain, the Netherlands, and even Brazil, coordinating the supply. He felt safe. He felt superior. He treated the business of drug trafficking with the same detachment as a logistics manager moving auto parts. But hubris is a dangerous thing. The very belief that he was untouchable was slowly becoming his greatest weakness. He began to believe his own myth. He started to relax, just a fraction. And in the world of organized crime, a fraction is all the police need. The National Crime Agency had been tracking Mulvey for years. They knew who he was. They knew he was the architect. But knowing it and proving it in a court of law are two very different things. They had watched his associates fall. They had intercepted shipments. But Mulvey remained elusive. He was careful not to leave forensic evidence. His fingerprints weren't on the bags. His name wasn't on the shipping manifests. The investigation, codenamed Operation Emperor, was a grinding war of attrition. It involved surveillance teams in multiple countries, wiretaps and financial forensics. They watched the money. They watched the travel patterns. But the breakthrough didn't come from a fingerprint or a witness. It came from the airwaves. Despite his caution, despite the burner phones, Mulvey made mistakes. The NCA, working with international partners, managed to deploy listening devices. They didn't just target his phone. They targeted his environment. The investigators were listening when things started to go wrong for the gang. In one intercepted conversation after a shipment had been seized, Mulvey was recorded venting his frustration. He wasn't speaking in code. He was speaking as a boss who had lost inventory. He referred to the rollers as his lollipops. He talked about the financial hit. He talked about the logistics. For the first time, the ghost had a voice. The police had a recording of James Mulvey explicitly discussing the details of the operation. He was heard saying, "Listen, no one can get to me," a statement that would later ring hollow in a courtroom. He talked about the quality of the work, the method of concealment, and the specific amounts involved. He was incriminating himself with every sentence, unaware that the very air in the room was betraying him. Simultaneously, the physical surveillance was tightening. The NCA tracked the movement of the rollers. They identified the warehouse in Tamworth and the depot in Leicestershire. They watched the trucks arrive. They watched the gang members unload the heavy steel cylinders. When they finally decided to strike, it was a coordinated takedown. They raided the industrial units. They found the rollers. They found the cutting equipment. It was the physical evidence they needed to corroborate the voice recordings. But Mulvey wasn't there. he was gone. As the net closed in, Mulvey sensed the danger. He went to ground. He left his luxury life in Spain. He moved across borders, trying to find a place where the warrant wouldn't reach him. He ended up in Lithuania, a cold, stark contrast to the sunny terraces of Marbella. He thought he could hide there, blend in, and wait for the heat to die down. The arrest, when it came, was stripped of all glamour. There was no high-speed chase. Armed police in Lithuania, acting on a European arrest warrant secured by the NCA, stormed a safe house. They found the godfather of Solihull half-naked, confused and cornered. The Untouchable was dragged out in handcuffs, his empire of steel having completely evaporated. He was extradited back to the UK to face the music. But Mulvey didn't go down quietly. In the interrogation room, he was defiant. He answered no comment to hundreds of questions. He stared down the detectives who had spent years hunting him. He believed that even now, he could beat the rap. He believed that the voice on the tape could be explained away, or that the link between him and the rollers was too circumstantial. The trial was a tense affair. Mulvey sat in the dock, watching as the prosecution laid out the pieces of the puzzle. They played the tapes. The jury heard the voice of the arrogance. They heard him bragging about his wealth, his power, and his cleverness. They heard him dismiss the efforts of the police. They saw the photos of the rollers, the hollowed-out steel tombs that had carried so much misery into the country. They saw the financial records, the unexplained wealth, the lifestyle that no legitimate job could support. Mulvey's defense tried to argue that he was a legitimate businessman, a gambler, a man of means but not a drug lord. But the weight of the evidence, like the rollers themselves, was crushing. The connection was undeniable. The man who claimed to be a ghost was revealed to be the very real architect of a £68 million conspiracy. When the verdict was read, the arrogance finally drained from his face. Guilty. The judge didn't hold back. He described Mulvey as a calculating, professional criminal who had flooded the UK with Class A drugs without a shred of conscience. He spoke of the lives destroyed by the cocaine and cannabis he had imported. He spoke of the violence and the addiction that fueled his jet-set lifestyle. James Mulvey, the man who thought he was smarter than the system, was sentenced to 32 years in prison. It was a sentence that meant the Solihull Godfather would likely die behind bars, or at the very least, spend the best decades of his life staring at a different kind of steel for bars of a cell. The dismantling of Mulvey's empire sent shockwaves through the UK underworld. It proved that distance is no protection. It proved that complex logistics and industrial concealment are no match for determined investigation and international cooperation. The NCA had taken down a man who operated at the very highest level of the drug trade. As a T-Eversen. They had pierced the steel and exposed the rot inside. The metal rollers, once the symbol of his genius, now sit in an evidence locker, rusting and obsolete. And James Mulvey, the man who once looked out over the Mediterranean and believed he owned the world, now looks at a concrete wall. The message to the criminal fraternity was clear and brutal. You can hide your drugs in steel. You can hide yourself in foreign lands. You can use encryption, and burners and middlemen. But eventually, you have to talk. Eventually, you have to make a move. And when you do, they will be watching. The ghost of Solihull was exorcised, not by magic, but by the grinding, relentless machinery of justice.